Did you know that the Philippines was stolen by the British from the Spaniards? What if the Philippines remained a British colony? What would have happened if the British never returned the Philippines to the Spaniards? Let's learn more. Mabuhay or in Kapampangan luwid kayo. Welcome back to my channel. It's me, Kirby Araullo, your friendly Pinoy historian. And if you are new to my channel, in this channel, I make videos about our people's colorful history, colorful traditions, culture, and everything in between. So don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. Welcome to part 2 of my video on the British invasion of the Philippines and the British occupation of Manila back in the late 1700s. Here in part 2, we'll talk more about the impacts of this invasion and occupation to the people of the Philippines and the history of our islands. And we'll also look into what many of you have asked me over the years. What if the British never returned the Philippines to Spain? What would have happened if the Philippines remained a British colony? So if you haven't seen part 1, make sure to watch it to learn more about the conflict itself and who really fought and won the battles. But for now, back to our topic. So what were the impacts of the British invasion and occupation of Manila back in the 1760s? First, let's look at one of the most obvious impact or result of these battles, the sacking of Manila. So the burning and the looting of Manila by the British resulted in a significant loss to the culture, the heritage, and the history of the Philippines. And not just colonial Philippines, but also pre-colonial Philippines. Words cannot even describe how much we lost. And not just in treasures or physical things, but more importantly, lost knowledge about our past, knowledge and wisdom about our ancestors. This is actually one of the major reasons why we don't have many surviving and accessible sources about our ancestors. Because a lot of it, the records and the artifacts were either stolen or even worse, burned and melted into oblivion during the British invasion. And as mentioned in my old video, Jose Rizal himself was astonished with the amount of Philippine artifacts and the treasures he found in the British Museum when he was visiting London in the late 1800s, and this was over 100 years after the sacking and the burning of Manila. And some of the few priceless artifacts that survived include the Baxter Codex, aka the Manila Manuscript, and Antonio de Morga's Sucesos de las Islas Filipinas. These two are among the most important surviving primary sources about early Philippine history. And Manila back then was one of the most prosperous cities and centers of global trade, connecting Asia to the Americas and to Europe. And this invasion and occupation burned Manila almost to the ground. It resulted in the pillaging of treasures and churches, the burning of homes, the massacre and the rape of innocent people. And as mentioned in part 1, to add insult to injury, the British also demanded 4 million Mexican silver dollars to save what remains of Manila and its people from being turned into ashes. But overall, the British occupation of Manila and Cavite only lasted from 1762 to 1764. So in part 1, I also mentioned how Bulacan back then, before the war, before the British invasion of Manila, Bulacan was then, predominantly Kapampangan. So what happened? Why is Bulacan Tagalog today? Most of us today are unaware that Bulacan was once Kapampangan. Since Bulacan today is among the bailiwicks or the bastion of the Tagalog language, traditions, and culture. But according to our elders, scholars, and culture bearers, both in Pampanga and in Bulacan, this was actually a result of the British invasion and occupation of Manila and parts of Cavite. So this war and the subsequent famine led to a massive number of Tagalog refugees that resettled in the province of Bulacan. So many Tagalog families from Cavite and nearby towns were displaced because of the violence, the hunger, because of the war. And they were welcomed by the Kapampangans and were given land to settle in the present-day province of Bulacan. And over the centuries, the Tagalog-speaking population of Bulacan slowly outnumbered the Kapampangan residents of Bulacan. In fact, many of the old clans of Bulacan actually have Kapampangan roots. You can see it in their own last names. But now, the Bulaqueños are predominantly Tagalog speakers, regardless if their ancestors were once Kapampangan or Tagalog. And actually, if we look at the original names of the towns and the barangays of Bulacan, we'll see that they have Kapampangan roots. They have Kapampangan names, such as San Miguel de Mayumu, Calantipay, Pandi, Malolos, Giginto, Baliwag, Kingwa, and many others. You know, it is also worth noting that for the most part of our colonial history, Bulacan was actually part of the vast province of La Pampanga. And according to the Center for Bulacan Studies at the Bulacan State University, it was only in the year 1755 that Bulacan was formally separated from La Pampanga to form its own province, or what is now the province of Bulacan. Now let's be honest, there are those who are fond of pitting Tagalogs versus Kapampangans, Kapampangans versus Bulaqueños. But if you actually dig deeper into our roots, the Kapampangan and Tagalog people of Central Luzon and Southern Luzon, we actually share quite a lot. And you know, honestly, as a historian and a culture bearer with both Tagalog and Kapampangan roots, believe me when I say that we have more in common than what we think divides us. So yes, there is still a lot more, so much more forgotten history we need to rediscover. So much more connections and interwoven roots that we have forgotten. So if you want to learn more, and if you want me to dig deeper into Bulacan's own history, beyond what is often told in the mainstream textbooks, let me know in the comments below. And of course, shout out to my family and friends in Bulacan. And perhaps the most significant impact of this invasion, this British invasion of the Philippines, was actually exposing the weakness of the Spanish Empire. So the British invasion of the Philippines and occupation of Manila showed the diverse people of the islands that the once mighty Spanish Empire was no longer the most powerful colonial empire on earth. And this resulted in the many uprisings throughout the Philippines, in places like Pampanga, Pangasinan, Ilocos, and Cagayan. And one of the most significant revolts and uprisings during this time was the Palaris Revolt of Pangasinan back in 1762 to 1765. It started in the town of Binalatongan and later spread like wildfire in the other towns of Malasiki, Bayambang, Manawag, Dagupan, Calasiao, Mangaldan, Santa Barbara, San Jacinto, and even all the way to Paniqui in what is now Tarlac. Actually, during this time, Paniqui was still part of the province of Pangasinan. And at its peak, the Pangasinense Palaris Revolt overthrew the colonial government and effectively controlled the province up to its southern border with La Pampanga, along the Agno River. In other words, they were pretty much independent from colonial rule for several years. And I would actually love to make a separate video about this in the future, so stay tuned. And comment below if you're from Pangasinan or have roots from Pangasinan. It is also worth noting that the Sangley, or the Chinese population of both Manila and Pampanga, also took advantage of the invasion to rise up and revolt against the oppressive Spaniards. Hundreds, if not thousands of the local Chinese population, including those with mixed indigenous roots, took part in the battles to help the British. This was because they were also victims of the racism, the oppression, and the exploitation under Spanish rule. So they saw this opportunity as their chance to fight back, to stand up for their rights against the injustices they faced under Spanish colonialism. And perhaps the most popular among these revolts that took advantage of the British invasion was none other than the Silang Revolt, led by the power couple Diego and Gabriela Silang. It was a revolutionary movement, an armed struggle to liberate Ilocos from Spanish colonialism back in the late 1700s. And as mentioned in part 1, unknown to many, including Filipinos, Diego Silang actually offered the Spaniards to lead the Ilocano forces to support Spain in defending the Philippines against the British invasion. But the Spanish Catholic Bishop of Vigan, Bernardo de Ustariz, rejected their offer. Ustariz back then was in charge of the colonial government of Ilocos. You know, this rejection, along with the brewing resentments against centuries of Spanish colonial abuses, it really pushed Ilocanos further into rising up against the Spaniards. And so the British took advantage of this, and they actually even promised Diego Silang to send British reinforcements to help the Ilocanos. But since the Kapampangan successfully cornered the British in Manila, the British were not able to send the Ilocanos any reinforcements against the Spaniards. And Diego Silang himself would soon die fighting for the liberation of Ilocos. But then, his beloved wife, the fierce Gabriela Silang, took on the mantle of leading one of the most historic revolts in the history of the Philippines. But anyways, this topic deserves its own video, or maybe even a series of videos about the Silang Revolt of Ilocos. Let's learn more about their epic uprising in future videos, and comment below if you're Ilocano. So now, let us shift our attention away from Luzon. Let us now talk about Sulu and Mindanao. So long before this invasion, the British were already interested in taking over Mindanao. They were attracted by the prospects or the potential of growing spices in the fertile lands of Mindanao. And if you remember, spices back then was a huge global industry. It was one of the most important global trade for centuries, a sought-after industry that led to the colonial conquest of Asia and Africa, and the so-called discovery of the Americas, aka the New World. And unknown to many, back then, Mindanao was often referred to as the Grand Moluccas because at one point in our history, it was seen as part of the Greater Spice Islands, the source of the expensive spices that the world needed to preserve their food, to preserve our food. And actually, on top of this, the British had also long been interested in establishing a trading base in the powerful Sultanate of Sulu. And as a result, after the Spaniards surrendered Manila to the British wasted no time to free Sultan Azimuddin I of Sulu. Sultan Azimuddin I, aka Alimuddin to the Spaniards, was then a captive of the Spaniards within the walls of Intramuros de Manila. And the British took advantage of this, so they quickly freed the Sultan and they forged a stronger alliance with the Sultanate of Sulu. As a result of this alliance, Sulu was drawn closer to the British and away from the Spaniards. And there was also an increased raiding by the Moros of Sulu and Mindanao against the coastal towns of Spanish colonial Philippines, targeting the Christian populations, especially those along the coast of the Visayas. But with the Treaty of Paris in 1763 that ended the 7 Years' War and resulted in the withdrawal of the British from Manila in 1764, the British prospects of dominating over the economies of Mindanao and Sulu dwindled. It is also worth noting and very important to remember that during this time, the era between the late 1600s to the early 1800s was actually the peak of power of the mighty Sultanate of Sulu when they practically dominated the waters of the Sulu Sea, the Celebes Sea, and even the West Philippine Sea, aka the South China Sea. So even if the British kept the Philippines as a colony, just like the Spaniards, the British would still have a hard time conquering Sulu or Mindanao. The mighty sultanates would most likely still remain independent regardless whether it was the British or the Spaniards that controlled Manila. Actually, for those who may not know, the pre-colonial kingdoms of Luzon and the sultanates of Sulu and Mindanao and Brunei were once interconnected with each other. In fact, the royal families of these kingdoms belong to the same clans. And you can learn more about this in my earlier videos and in my books, so check out the links below for more resources. Now, just to clarify some of the comments in my earlier videos about the British invasion of the Philippines, this was not the reason, not the direct reason why Sulu gave the British control or lease over North Borneo, aka Sabah, or why Sabah ended up being part of Malaysia today. But yes, this is another topic that deserves its own video or series of videos. So let me know in the comments below if you would like me to make a video about the conflicts and the controversies surrounding the claims over Sabah, aka North Borneo, including the impacts of this conflict to the people of Sabah and Sulu. And by the way, speaking of the Visayas, during this time while all of these were happening in Luzon and Mindanao, it is important for us to remember and know that the island and the province of Bohol in the Visayas was independent from Spanish rule for about 2 decades. The revolt, led by Francisco Dagohoy, succeeded in overthrowing the Spaniards from Bohol in 1744. They successfully liberated the Bulacan people from the exploitation of Spanish colonialism. They declared Bohol's independence on July 4, 1744, and they remained independent until 1829. And this is known today as the longest anti-colonial uprising in the history of the Philippines, and perhaps in the history of Southeast Asia. And you can learn more about it in the video that I made in both Tagalog and in English, so make sure to check them out after this video. So what would have happened if the British never returned the Philippines to the Spaniards? Would it be better for our people, for the Philippines, if it remained a British colony? You know, if it remained part of the British Empire? What would happen to our people under British colonialism? Now this is actually one of the most frequently asked questions or statements made in the comments regarding this topic. You know that the Philippines today would have been so much better if we were a colony of the United Kingdom and not of the Spaniards. And they would often cite the present-day countries of Singapore and Malaysia, or cities like Hong Kong, as shining examples of this. Now it is nice to reimagine the Philippines having a different reality, a better reality, one in which our people are better off, where inequalities are almost non-existent. You know, especially given the present-day struggles and conditions of our people and our country, it is easy for us to be fascinated by the glitz and the glamour of our neighbors. But this is usually with a vague understanding of the history and the struggles of the people in these countries. Because all we see today are their shiny, soaring skyscrapers and what seems like limitless wealth and unstoppable development. But if we actually dig deeper into the history of the British Empire and the conditions of their former colonies, then we'll see that they are not immune to corruption and injustices, that the British also committed atrocities in their own colonies. In fact, many scholars would even argue that the British committed some of the worst colonial exploitation and atrocities in history, from the massacres of indigenous people to the famines affecting millions of people, and of course, the dark and bloody history of the global slave trade. The glorified British Empire was no better than the much vilified Spaniards. And if we actually carefully study the history and the present-day issues plaguing their former colonies, many of these conflicts are the products of the British Empire itself. And there are many examples of this all around the world, like the racial tensions that led to Singapore breaking away from Malaysia, or the apartheid in South Africa, and just recently, the newly discovered mass graves of indigenous children in Canada. And actually, if we think about it, many of today's global conflicts, from the liberation of Palestine against Israel and the conflicts in the Middle East to the genocide happening today in Myanmar, and even the racial violence here in the United States, all of these can one way or another trace their roots all the way back to British imperialism. But then again, many Filipinos today would say, look at Malaysia, look at Singapore, look at Hong Kong. They're like paradise compared to the situation of the Philippines today, and we cannot blame them. But the thing is, these countries, these places are not immune to corruption. We just don't learn about it. We just don't see the news in the Philippines. And actually, my cousin, the critically acclaimed journalist Araullo, just released a documentary with Vice Asia about one of the biggest corruption scandals of today. And nope, it did not happen in the Philippines, but in Malaysia. And I'll include the links below to learn more. And like I mentioned before, history is not black and white. Being a former British colony is not a guarantee for success. It is not a blueprint for a prosperous society. The only guarantee under British rule would be Britain profiting from the exploitation of our people's labor and of our motherland's resources. It is nice to imagine what would have happened if history took a different path. What if this or that happened instead? But the bottom line is, colonialism will never be good for the colonized people. No matter the glitz and glamour we see on the surface, the plundering and the exploitation under the colonizers outweighs whatever we may think as good outcomes of colonialism. But we also cannot erase colonialism from our histories, and instead we must genuinely study history and learn the lessons from colonialism and from the experiences of our people. What we need is to reflect and apply these lessons to forge stronger unities with our own people and take actions to address the inequalities, the injustices, the exploitations that millions of our people are still facing today. You know, regardless of who colonized us, we should not ignore the present-day conditions of our people back in the motherland and across the diaspora. It won't really matter who colonized us in the past if we today do not take a stand to defend our sovereignty, to defend the rights and the freedom of our people. None of this would really matter if we just turn a blind eye to all the injustices, all the exploitation, the violence, and the inequalities all around us. None of it would matter. And I'll leave it at that. But if you really want me to make a video exploring the different possibilities or scenarios imagining if the Philippines was a British colony instead, then let me know in the comments below. That might actually be a fun video to make in the future. But anyways, if you like this video or learn a thing or two, don't forget to like, share this video, comment down below, and please subscribe. And make sure to hit that bell icon so you don't miss out on my future videos. But of course, before we go, today's shoutout goes to Jel Mendoza from the Philippines, Sophie Zalas from Malaysia, Aliyah from Singapore, Abby Esnar from Toronto, and special shoutout to my patron Kyle Deliosa. And of course, special thanks, many special thanks to all my patrons through the years. Thank you for all your love and support throughout these years. Dakal pong salamat, daghang salamat, magsukol, terima kasih, agyamanak, maraming salamat po. So if you want to help me make more videos like this, show your support, and please be my patron or get a copy of any of my books, or coloring books, or any of the merch link down below. And actually, all of my books are on sale this month, so make sure to follow me on social media to learn more. Maraming salamat po. Daghang salamat, terima kasih, magsukol, syukran, abenal, agyamanak, dakal pong salamat. See you next time, or in Tagalog, kita kits, and in Kapampangan, Mikitix!